The first question that I want to ask you, it might seem a little strange, but I assume having us in here, there's a story that Huawei wants to tell, that there's some message that you want to get out. So my first question is this: why are we here?
Well, we've always been very open and transparent about inviting journalists like yourself, esteemed journalists, news organizations to come and visit Huawei. I think there's lots of misunderstandings, lots of misinformation out there about what we do. It's always great and welcome to Huawei when news organizations come and talk to us face to face.
All right, pick one. I know you're in touch with, and you travel a lot. You're just back from an event in Mexico City. Pick one misunderstanding. If you had to say, here's something about Huawei that the people in the United States, generally speaking, are getting wrong. What is?
I would say that there's a huge misunderstanding about the type of company that Huawei is. Huawei is a privately owned company. And more than that, it has a very kind of unique ownership structure in which all the employees have an ownership of the company. Okay? So it's kind of a company that's held in trust for the benefit of the employees. Mm-hmm. There is no real connection to the state in China. We are part of that thriving private business sector. So I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding.
That there's no connection between Huawei and the Chinese government, no direct connection.
There's no direct connection, there's no ownership, there's no percentage of shareholding that's part of the Chinese state.
Questions that have been brought up when accusations have been made against the company, mostly now from the U.S. government, have centered around things that might happen in the future. Of course, there's been back and forth for years between you and other companies about intellectual property, but a lot of that's been litigated in the courts and talked about and what have you. Most of the current questions seem to be about things that could happen, that Huawei could be used to facilitate spying. So what do you say to people who look at Chinese law, for example, the National Intelligence Law of 2017? They read through it, and it says it requires organizations and citizens to, quote, support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence work. People read that and they say, well, if the Chinese government came and asked for data from you by law, you would have to provide it. What do you say?
So I think that there are several issues around this. I mean, first of all, Li Keqiang, who's the Premier of China, has made it very clear that this law does not apply to Chinese equipment manufacturers. So that's the most important first issue.
Who does it apply to? It applies to other companies?
It applies to companies that hold and curate and manage data in China. But even that law does not apply beyond Chinese borders. For equipment manufacturers like Huawei, it doesn't count at all, and that's been made very clear. Secondly, I think my colleague Andy Purdy has explained many times in American media that Huawei doesn't touch the data. Okay? It's managed by our telecom partners. So there's no way that we could manipulate or touch data and send it anywhere. Whenever Huawei, if it has to go and fix and maintain a network, there are very strict rules about how we do that, and everything that we do is logged.
Can you explain it to me a little bit? I want to understand, to the best of my ability, the actual technology. Say a feature, because a lot of this is about the rollout of 5G. 5G has been implemented in a country. Huawei is going to update that technology and is rolling out an update. As part of that update, wouldn't there be access to the data? And then if that data was asked for, you would have it in-house?
No, essentially we are producing physical hardware products that we supply to customers. We would work with the customer to build out the network. So this isn't even a hypothetical, it's something that's happening right now. So we are in many countries, we operate in over 170 countries around the world. Many of those countries are now deploying their 5G networks, and so we work very closely with those partners to build out the hardware. But at all times, the telecom completely in charge of all the data. There's no need for us to touch any of the data at all.
There's no need to, but I just want to be clear on this point, and then I want to move on to some other things. There's no need for you to, but could you?
No, we couldn't do it without the permission of the telecom company.
Could you do it without their permission in a hypothetical,
no.
If the government asked you? Is it technically possible?
It's not, to my knowledge, it's not technically possible.
Next part about this is the practical impact, because no matter what the situation is, if the U.S. government is cracking down on Huawei and has essentially blacklisted the company, there's obviously an impact. So as long as this export ban stays in place, is there a real threat to Huawei's survival as a company?
Like all companies, we have business continuity plans in place. So far, the company is still thriving. We're still recruiting at previous rates. We're still growing. We hope to have a double-digit sales growth this year. Yeah, of course, we have lots of plan Bs in place. I mean, I suppose one of the big things at the moment is that we live in a very unstable and uncertain policy environment. So we are working very hard to come up with lots of different contingency plans.
And one of them surrounds operating systems, right? You're rolling out or working on your own operating system, since your phones that you introduce won't be able to have the Google Android system. Maybe that changes at some point, but if that doesn't, your own operating system will be ready to roll out when? What's the timetable?
Unfortunately, I don't really have any information to share on that issue. As I say, it's part of a larger contingency plan that we might have in place. I really don't know, to be honest.
The longer it takes, the more of a risk, though, right, for the company?
Well, no, we've got contingency plans in place. We can't actually reveal, the full details of those at the moment. Our default position, of course, is that we want to continue to work with our American partners. So as the number 2 seller of smartphones in the world, we've built a very strong partnership with Google over the years, and we're a very key customer of theirs. We'd like to continue to use the Android operating system, and likewise with Microsoft with the Windows operating system.
But because of what's been going on, it's going to take you a little bit longer to get to number 1, won't it?
Watch this space, because the Chinese market's actually the most important in the world in terms of smartphone sales. So there's lots that's going on in the Chinese market, and actually Huawei has been performing exceptionally strongly here.
When will you be the number 1 smartphone?
Well, my background is in economics, so I know it's very foolish to try and do forecasts. So hopefully we'll be number 1 next year, let's say that.
Number 1 in 2020?
Yeah.
The other big issue, at least from analysts we speak to, is what's happening with chips for semiconductors. So what's happening on this campus today? Are people working to develop Huawei's own chips?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of information in the latest annual report, but of course, we are always working on new innovations. We're one of the biggest investors in research and development in the world. According to the EU, we're the 5th biggest company in the world now in terms of research and development. So there's many spheres of research and technological areas that we're pushing forward on in terms of development.
Is your own chip business, is it fair to say, a large part of that, the largest part of that in the near term?
Oh, no, it goes through a myriad of different technologies. So there's still fundamentally, a lot of the research that we do is around mobile communication technologies and 5G.
The question of making your own chips, is that something that can be done this year, or is some of that already being done?
Well, we do make our own chips, so there are chips that are put into our higher-end smartphones. That's very much part of a global supply chain. It's a misnomer to think that there's independence of companies globally. All these products that we use every day, like our smartphones, our laptops, our pads, they're part of a much wider global supply chain. Components from many different countries around the world.
Right.
So they're global products. The elements that we produce are only a very small part of that global supply chain.
Well, in effect, that's the problem, though, right? If that supply chain is interrupted and you're not permitted to work with some of your partners.
Yes, and I think Huawei gets a lot of the attention and focus on this, but as I mentioned, there is a huge global supply chain out there, and the disruption and the policy uncertainty that now exists in the global business environment will have victims everywhere. In fact, there's a very recent study that's been published that suggests that just the impact of constraining Huawei could lead to $56 billion in lost export sales for the United States. Threatens 74,000 jobs. That's a study that's just come out by the ITIF in the USA.
Explain that to me a little bit. As you said, your training is as an economist, and that's economists speak to go to a study like that. But for a person watching in the United States, they might say, this doesn't affect me at all. Huawei, I hear about it, but they don't have a huge footprint in the United States. You're saying there could be an impact from what the U.S. government is doing to Huawei on Americans. What's that impact? What does it actually look like?
Well, the impact is that Huawei is actually a big consumer of American technology products. Our procurement budget in the US alone is $11 billion a year. So stopping Huawei being able to interact with those technology partners that it's built relationships with for a couple of decades will mean that they are lost export sales, and they can't be picked up by other companies. So that estimate is 56 billion, and that 56 billion includes 74,000 jobs. Now, that might be in those kind of technology sectors, but clearly a fall in export sales for the USA will have multiplier effects on many other jobs within the US economy.
Let me ask you this. What if all of that is true, and President Trump looks at it and says, I'm willing to sacrifice those near-term losses for American companies because he believes this effort against Huawei is for the greater good? Then what? Then what happens to Huawei?
Huawei will invest its research and development funds and its activities in those countries where it's more welcome.
What does that look like?
Well, at the moment that we operate in over 170 countries in the world, so it's unfortunate. We'd love to work in the USA. There are many studies that show that constraining competition in markets is hugely costly. There's a study recently for the European Union which shows that restricting Chinese equipment manufacturers in the European Union market will raise costs and prices for consumers of around 55 billion euros. So restricting competition in any market ultimately always means that the customers suffer. So the USA, in constraining competition in several markets, if it goes down that road, is a strategy that essentially will backfire on consumers. Consumer prices will rise.
My question is, what if the United States government and the President of the United States is willing to make that sacrifice? There have been many articles written about ZTE when the similar ban was in place, that if that ban wasn't lifted, ZTE would have been put out of business. Isn't the same true for Huawei?
The situation at Huawei is very different because it's not so dependent on those kind of issues. Okay? In terms of the market presence, ZTE's market presence in the USA was much bigger. Our international operations are much more expansive than ZTE's. So it's a very different kind of play. In terms of the sacrifice, well, it's a sacrifice that if the US is willing to make, something that's not being copied or picked up by other countries around the world. So clearly, the UK, Germany, the European Union have looked at the costs against these other types of issues and have decided that they want to keep working with Huawei.
So which countries are you investing in more now?
We have invested in many different countries around the world. We have a very large presence in emerging markets, but Europe as well is a very important market for Huawei.
I want to tap into your expertise now to maybe have a little bit of a more global look at things. We've already done that in speaking about the supply chain, but this trade dispute, I think, is carried on a little bit longer than many people anticipated, and now the feeling seems to be that it might carry on for a very, very long time, that there might be some sort of a split in the ecosystems. Decoupling is a word that's often used between the United States and China. Do you subscribe to that, or do you worry about that?
Oh, yeah, I don't subscribe to it, and I'm extremely worried about it. I mean, you had the fortune to track the kind of globalization of the world in terms of trading products and services, movement of people, movement of information. I think in aggregate, it's very clear that we have all benefited from that enormously. Hundreds of millions of people were raised out of abject poverty around the world because of these global linkages. And that's a really good thing for humanity. So this kind of pullback from globalization, I think, should be a concern for everybody. As I said, all the technology products that we love and use every day essentially have been produced by those global supply chains. If we start to try and break those and recede from globalization, there will be huge costs. And it's probably the worst time to be doing this because the technologies that are coming together, including 5G, AI, robotics, cloud computing, they look like the real thing. They're called general purpose technologies in their economics, and they could transform our societies. We could have a real boost in productivity growth going through to the next decade, which will mean our wages will keep increasing. So to try and stimulate this right now is and should be a great concern to everybody.
Well, you talked about how you are quite worried about it. How do you think it's going to play out from observing what's going on at your company and just looking at other factors? What do you think is going to happen?
So as I mentioned previously, it's almost impossible to forecast the future. Who knows what's going to happen? I think the first thing is that we really have to pull back as well from this policy uncertainty. We are starting to see perhaps poor economic numbers being released because there's lots of uncertainty. Companies are pulling back from investing. I hope that as the costs, the real costs of these kind of strategies and policies are starting to be realized, that common sense will prevail. So I think we're all very hopeful that at the G20 there'll be some realization that we have to come to some form of agreement on these issues, spend a lot more time looking at the facts, the evidence, let's do some evidence-based policy making and come to some broader agreement.
What's a realistic expectation for the G20?
That's very difficult to say. Working at Huawei, it's not something that we analyse too much. We're not really involved in the politics. But as I say, I'm hoping that common sense will prevail. I think just last week there were 600 CEOs in the US that have written to the president to highlight their real desperate concerns about the trajectory of US foreign policy.
Talk to me a little bit, if you can, about the Chinese economy. You live here in Shenzhen. What's your observation of how much of a slowdown we're really seeing in China right now?
Well, it's very difficult for me to say because Shenzhen is, probably one of the most advanced and developed cities in China. It's also a very outward-facing city in terms of its technology cluster. So here, certainly, things seem to be thriving more than ever. So, just the energy, the dynamism, and the business activities of the city look to be very strong and continuing to grow.
But more broadly in the country, are you concerned?
I think there was a data release for the Chinese manufacturing sector, which was of concern. But most of that seems to be led by a fall in domestic demand. I think that's no surprise, given the uncertain policy environment, as I mentioned. But a lot of it seems to be destocking.
Right.
So basically, companies are still active, but they're building less in terms of stock and inventory.
Final thing on the 5G rollout. We've talked about it a little bit, but what's happening to the timetable of the global rollout of 5G technology because of, I guess, the dispute between Huawei and the United States government, or the crackdown on Huawei by the United States government? What's the actual impact been on 5G's rollout globally?
Well, there seems to be little impact. So lots of countries around the world are testing their 5G networks. There is a national network that's live now in Korea, I believe in Switzerland as well, the UK. So many countries developing their networks. We'll really see the full global development in 2020. We'll really start going live. A lot of it depends on the handsets and other devices in terms of their 5G capability. But everyone is still pushing ahead, and we're working with many partners around the world. If there is a complete constraint in many markets on 5G from Chinese equipment manufacturers, then there are estimates that this will lead to a lag in the rollout of 5G of between 18 months and 2 years. So there's a real risk that all the benefits that we expect to gain and all the economic advantages of 5G will be delayed the more companies and competition is restricted around the world.
To be clear, that hasn't happened yet, but it's a risk that it could happen, that type of delay.
At the moment, as I say, the policy environment is so uncertain. There is uncertainty, so maybe some investment is being pulled back. But as far as I'm aware, 5G rollout plans are pushing forward as expected.
Fair enough. Andrew, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.